The next speaker is somebody I am super excited to introduce to the IYCA community. Now, some of the other speakers you probably know. Like, you've seen Ron on social media or speaking somewhere else. You've seen Rob Taylor. You've seen some of these people before. The next speaker, she doesn't do all that kind of stuff. She is not all over social media. She doesn't have stuff all over the place. But I was introduced to this person from a friend of mine who told me about her and what she's doing for injury prevention. And when she starts explaining how we can do things differently from an injury prevention standpoint than what we're currently doing, and you start to see like how she thinks and how it works, I think you're really it's going to open your eyes to like a whole new world, and I'm just super excited to introduce physical therapist and owner and creator of Stability Enhancement Systems, Selena Budge. The music is our way of getting back at the other room, so we'll try to blast it once in a while.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Ron, if you're still in the room, I really enjoyed your presentation. Is my mic on? I don't know if I have to shout or not. Is everybody can hear me? Ron, I haven't seen you speak before, but that was great. Thank you so much. I'm going to steal something from him right now that I just learned in his presentation. So Jim said we didn't do social media. Well, I don't do social media, and that's more or less true, but I have hired some otters and some beavers, so we are becoming more active on it. Michaela does a lot of our stuff back there. Hi, Michaela. Hello. So she is my otter. Jim, that was a really nice, he's left already. All right. Well, that was a really nice introduction. So he is correct. So my business is in injury risk reduction, and I'm going to take you through kind of the science behind what we do, how we approach things, and go from there. So we're going to use the terms SES and injury risk reduction kind of interchangeably because SES is easier to say, and it's our stability-based approach to injury risk reduction. So here is the scoop on us. Does anybody know what movie this screenshot is from?
Love and Basketball.
Yes! Okay, so this is a screenshot from Love and Basketball. I like to liken myself to the lady on the left, not an actual representation of me, but I started off playing basketball, and like her, if you've ever seen the movie, I thought I was going to be the first female in the NBA. That did not happen, but I did end up playing college basketball. Neither one of those is me. That's not me either, but that is me. And I'm pretty sure that this armbar is now considered a foul, but that is an excellent defensive stance. So, I played college basketball, and then I ended up having a few injuries of my own. So I had a very serious ankle injury that needed surgery, and I also had an ACL injury. So this is not actual timeline correct of when the injuries were happening, but it's the only injured picture I could find of myself. So instead, I went into graduate school and got my doctorate in physical therapy and sports rehab with a research emphasis on injury risk reduction, biomechanics of injury. And we started a company called Stability Enhancement Systems. So our company partners with sports performance centers, medical centers, basically trying to help support injury risk reduction in any way we can. In some places, that's more support. In some places, that's less support. Some people say, come in, do this for us, do our screenings, do our programming, everything like that. Other places say, come in, show us what we need to do, and we can run from there. So we have a couple different ways that we work depending on what we need. We work all the way from middle school and high school athletes up to Olympic athletes and everything in between. So we have a pretty wide spectrum of athlete that we cater to, and along with coaches and performance, strength, and conditioning people. So, I mentioned we have a bunch of these different collaboration efforts, basically trying to support correct injury prevention programming in different types of structures. We also will hopefully partner up with the IYCA to bring a certification to you guys and have resources available through through a vault in that way. All right, so people all the time tell me there is nothing you can do to reduce the risk for injuries, and this is usually the face I give them. I thought this was a really funny addition to my PowerPoint, but not everybody agrees. All right, so there's a lot of things people talk about with injury predisposition. There's a ton of different factors that go into it. It's multi-variable factors that help bring somebody to their injury risk profile. So I get a lot of things told saying, when people say there's nothing you can do about injury, people talk about fatigue, about hormones, about body structure, bad luck, incidental contact, and all of those things are true. But we like to look at injury risks the same way you would look at any type of risk factor. So, for instance, there are risk factors for diabetes, for high cholesterol, for osteoporosis, some of them being family history, genetics, predispositions for a lot of different reasons. But what we say is that there are also modifiable factors that you can use. So if you had a family history of diabetes, you would then alter your exercise, your diet plan to lower your risk. The same is true of injury prevention. So there are things that might predispose you, non-modifiable factors, gender, hormones, family disposition, but there is one huge modifiable factor that you can affect, and that's what we like to focus on. So here are all your non-modifiable factors. You guys have probably heard about these, seen about these, all of those. Is that correct? Is everybody familiar kind of with the non-modifiable factors? Yeah. So the one huge modifiable factor is your biomechanics, or neuromuscular control strength. And so that is the one that we really like to focus in on to help prevent the risk for catastrophic injury especially. So your big injuries, your ACLs, the things that will take you out for a whole season. And there is some preliminary research coming out of a physician with Ohio State in collaboration with, I think, some other people at the Cleveland Clinic, that all of the non-modifiable factors put together don't contribute to injury as much as the one modifiable factor, which is really good news for us, because that means that there's a lot we can do to affect it. Now, I always give the disclaimer, there's nothing you can do 100% that's going to say you'll never get injured. It's not possible. But what we can do, sorry, I'm in your way, is reduce your risk for injury. Okay, so like I said, all the time I hear about how people tear their ACLs because of wide hips and menstrual cycles, and I just want to highlight the fact that here are 3 gentlemen who have all torn their ACLs and had unbelievable knee problems, and their hips are really not that wide, and I guarantee you they've never had a menstrual cycle. So we know there has to be something else at play here. And here's a picture of RG3 doing his second one. I love the shock value in that. So I want to also point out that he was wearing a knee brace during that injury. So there's 2 things about that video. The first, he was wearing a knee brace. The second, it was a non-contact injury. So a lot of people ask me, after I have knee surgery, do I need to have a brace? And my answer is that wearing a brace won't necessarily help you from preventing a non-contact injury. There's no research that suggests that it will either improve your chances to stay healthy or hurt your chances to stay healthy. There's really no definitive research that it has an effect at all. What it may do is help with some contact injuries. I'll give it that. But if you think about it, the brace is stabilizing the knee centimeters outside of the joint. And the ACL is in the joint and tearing within millimeters of movement. So especially, it doesn't help a ton with rotational injuries, which is what most ACLs are, which is a pivot, a cut, a plant. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So a lot of people ask me, you know, why did this athlete get injured? They are so strong. I can't understand why this really strong, powerful, athletic guy, girl got injured. And I always tell them being strong isn't enough. Sometimes strength and conditioning coaches get a really bad rap because somebody got injured and the first person they look at is you, like, what did you do wrong? And although strength is important, there must be another factor at play, because we see some of the most powerful, strongest athletes still get hurt, like an RG3, a Jabari Parker, a Derrick Rose. They're all strong. So there must be something additional on that is at play here. So I talk about the difference between strength and stability. So strength is the ability to produce force. This is how I'm going to define it. And stability is the ability to control force, okay? Stability is usually the piece that is missing when somebody gets injured. And we'll go through a little bit kind of what that talks about. So is there some way we can talk about injury predictability? Yes, there is. You can never say, yes, for sure this person is going to get injured, or no, this person is not, but we can say, what is their risk, let's say. Ironically, I had an athletic director of a college ask me the other day if I could come in and screen recruits before they offer to say whether or not they should continue to offer. It would be a bad investment. So probably that's the worst of college sports. So I was like, hit them with the, well, I'm not sure that's exactly ethical, but so I don't want to say, I would never say, yes, for sure you're getting injured, please quit your career now, don't give them a scholarship, please deny them an education. So there are things that we can do that we can pick up on injury risk, likelihood, and from that, we don't dismiss the kid, we just create a program to help rectify what is missing with them, what we need to train. So, does anybody know who this guy is? Everybody says Jimmy Butler, and he looks kind of like Jimmy Butler in this photo, but it's not. Anyone? Well, that's me, and that's Harry Giles. Does anybody know who Harry Giles is? Okay. We did fine on all of his strength, his mobility testing, everything along those lines. And then we took a look at some more sport-specific testing, some sport-specific speed testing, jumping, landing, those kind of things. And when we took a screenshot of some of his jumping, it ended up looking like this. Alarming. So, we are really concerned about this angle here. And so we have that angle, a lot of people call it the valgus angle. And he's not naturally born that way. It's not like he is a female with very wide hips and has a terrible Q angle or anything like this. This is a functional valgus, okay? So we have it at 31 degrees, and that is way, 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 way too high. There's a lot of there's no specific cutoff score about what amount of valgus is okay, because there's a lot of factors that go into that. Lever arms, torque generated, there's a ton of factors, but I usually say we like 8 degrees or below. 31 degrees is way, way too much. So about 2 weeks after we took this footage, he ended up suffering his second ACL tear, okay? Now, at that time, it was between his right before his senior and his freshman year in college. And he had already missed a year of high school with the first ACL tear. And we'll talk about percentages later. So if somebody tears their ACL once, how much likelihood is there for them to tear again, things along those lines. But at the time, he was the #1 kid coming out of high school. If any of you have followed him, he hasn't probably played meaningful basketball in about 2.5 years maybe, because even this year at Duke, he didn't play a full season, which is really unfortunate because he's unbelievably talented. And for him, this will not only affect his long-term health, but his stock in the draft, how much money he'll make. This could be millions of dollars, because people are really looking at him differently now, right? So he would have been, maybe, if he could have stayed healthy, a top 5 pick, and he's probably a 19-20 now. So why do really strong, powerful athletes still get injured? So this is a little bit about kind of the science behind our approach, why we take this approach, things along those lines. So we talk a lot about ACL injury because that's the big one, but a lot of these injury principles can be applied to other parts of the body as well. So, for instance, with an ACL injury specifically, There's the initial cut, pivot, landing incident, right? So the change of direction, landing, and then you see it go. Kind of like when you just saw RG3 go to plant and twist, and that thing just popped. So after the initial cut, pivot, landing incident, the ACL is torn within 100 milliseconds after that. Very, 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 very fast. Most of them are happening within this 50 to 100 millisecond range. So when we do our normal strength and conditioning exercises, the exercises that make us strong and powerful, hang cleans, squats, everything along those lines that are going to help performance, we train from a higher part of the brain, right, the motor cortex. They are conscious movement. So what I mean by that is that when you go to squat, it's a planned movement. You think to yourself, I'm going to pick up this bar off the rack, I'm going to squat, and then you squat. It doesn't happen as deliberately as that, but that's essentially what's going on in the body. You never unexpectedly squat, okay? Can we all agree on that? Okay. So for the motor cortex to send a signal down to the muscle from the brain, it takes at least 120 milliseconds. And that's in your fastest athletes, your Usain Bolts. So we can say most of our athletes aren't even right about here. They're probably in this area around here. So what's the problem? My hand. That's the problem, my hand. What is the problem with this picture? Anybody? So it's slow, exactly. There's a gap in time. So it's not necessarily that the kid wasn't strong enough, it's that the muscle didn't react fast enough to prevent the injury. There's a mismatch in the timing. So you have the initial cut, pivot, landing, the ACL tears, there's a gap in time, and then the muscle kicks in. But by the time that muscle kicks in, the ACL is already torn. So what you see, if any of you have had kids that have had an ACL tear, how many of you, by the way, in this room have been around an ACL tear? Yeah, a ton. You will sometimes hear that the kid gets a reactive bone bruise. Has anybody heard of that, a bone bruise? Okay, it's when the ACL tears, the bones drift apart, and then the muscle kicks in with that delayed timing, and it pulls the bones back together so forcefully that it creates a bruise on the bone. All right? So a lot of times that having good strength will help keep you maybe from putting yourself in compromising positions. Let's say that. But if you do get in that compromising position, there has to be something else that will help keep you safe and stabilize that joint, because otherwise there'll be a gap in time. All right? So what we are doing is creating and training from the lower part of the brain, the cerebellum. So there's three ways essentially in your body a muscle can turn on. So the first one would be right here from the motor cortex. That's the one we just talked about. The second one would be from this lower part of the brain, let's just say the cerebellum for simplicity. And the third way is through the spinal cord kind of reflexes, okay? So it's really hard to train reflexes in the spinal cord, so there's not a lot that we can do about that, especially in a healthy subject. I'm making a general statement here. The two other ones, the motor cortex and the cerebellum, are very trainable, so that's kind of what we want to focus on. And when the cerebellum is trained correctly, it can solidify pathways down to the muscle to turn on within 50 milliseconds, okay? So essentially that is the perfect window to help prevent injury. One of the reasons that it can send a signal down to the muscle to turn on so quickly is because it doesn't have to be processed higher. So all the stuff up here is thought about consciously. It has to be processed higher. This is more like an automatic deployment, okay? So, for instance, I'll give you an example of the three exercises from three ways the muscle can turn on from the three different parts of the brain. The first one, we talked about it, the motor cortex. When you go to squat, you think about it. The second one is if you touch a hot stove, you don't think to yourself, the stove is hot, I now must remove my hand, right? Your body has a really smart mechanism where you touch it and you automatically come off. It happens so fast to help protect you. So that's like a spinal cord reflex. Or when you go to the doctor and the doctor hits your knee and then you kick. Spinal cord reflex, right? The cerebellum, which is kind of like the something in between that, is as if you were to go outside and you trip. You don't think to yourself, I'm going to put my right leg forward now and control myself from landing. Your body automatically corrects so that you don't face plant, hopefully, in most circumstances. Best case scenario. So that is your cerebellum at work, okay? That is that in between. And so we need to focus in on that and capitalize and train that so that we can make that relevant to athletic performance, so that we can get that same level of reactivity when an athlete is going like a bat out of hell down the court. And that is kind of the crux of our SES program. All right, any questions on that? I know that was a big slide with a lot of information. We could take maybe questions at the end. Is everybody with me still? All right, I get really excited about this sciencey part, and I'm in a room where that's appreciated, I think. All right, so how do we kind of go about looking at a kid? So the first thing we want to do is evaluate or identify predisposing factors. That was a cheer for me, I'd like to think. All right, so the first thing so we have to evaluate the kid, all right? We can't just look at injury. A lot of people try to look at injury prevention too simplistically, where they just put all the kids on the same 5 exercises, do these exercises forever, and good luck. But no other skill development in life works that way. You wouldn't tell a kid, oh, thanks. You wouldn't tell a kid to lift a 5-pound dumbbell all season long and expect to get stronger. So the same is true of any skill development. And injury risk reduction or injury prevention is a skill development. So the first thing you have to do is figure out what kind of evaluation methods you want to use. So we always want to look at evidence-based methods where there's some reliability and there's some good research behind it so that you know you're measuring exactly what you're looking to measure, so on and so forth. Okay, the second thing you want to make sure is that you want sport speed specific testing, okay? So what I mean by this is a lot of people, how many of you guys have heard of the FMS? Okay. So we use some FMS movements in our testing because we think that they do provide some helpful information. However, what we were seeing were we had athletes that tested really great on the FMS, and then, like a Harry Giles, and then we took a look at their jumping, and there is some breakdown between the two of them. If you would have just looked at the FMS, he would have passed with flying colors. And then you look at his jumping, and it's atrocious. So there's some breakdown there, and part of the reason is that the FMS does anybody not know what the FMS is? Okay. The FMS is an injury risk screening tool that puts a kid through a bunch of different movements: an overhead squat, an inline lunge, shoulder mobility, all these different types of movements. The problem is all of these movements, I don't want to say the problem, the issue raised is that all of these movements are ground-based, low level, not speed specific. So how can we tell how a kid moves when they're at full speed jumping if we never look at them full speed jumping? So all of it is very controlled, very thought out. If you just use the FMS type screening tool, you're missing a huge piece of this, okay? So we want sport speed specific testing evaluations to see what this kid looks like during the circumstances that they would most likely be injured in, which is not shoulder mobility or a controlled overhead squat. Now, I do want to say that some of those movements might be able to help explain what you would see on video of your jumping or of the cutting. We also like to have some redundancy within our testing so that if one test misses something, the other one might pick it up. So we choose a battery of tests to try and get a whole picture of what the kid might look like. We also like to look at full body. So when you're evaluating somebody, you can't just say, I'm only going to fix the knees, because there might be a problem at the thoracic spine that's affecting the lumbar spine, which is affecting the hip, which will then affect the knee. So the body is one kinetic chain, right? So you have to look at everything and fix it so that everything can kind of be in the same gear, the same motion, because you could have a problem higher up in the chain that's affecting what's going on at the knee, right? Or something lower, right? There could be a problem with ankle mobility and now your knee is taking up excessive motion, all right? And the last one is the one that we rely on the heaviest, which is video analysis of the biomechanics, which is really important because you want to know what they look like during a sport-specific movement. And when you capture it on video, you can then slow it down frame by frame and see exactly what's going on. So some people might use two-dimensional video, and that is great and fine, and there's enough research to show that there's a good correlation between 2D and 3D video capture. We are really excited because we are going to start to move towards 3D motion capture. And most people do not do 3D motion capture in our setting because it is extremely tedious, it's extremely time-consuming. Has anyone been in a biomechanics lab and run kids through testing? It takes forever, right? All those markers, all those cameras. If you've done it, what do you think the average time to run an athlete through all of the testing you want to do is?
It's like a half hour at least.
Yeah, so it's a half hour at least. I would say probably for us it's like an hour to take a kid through a biomechanics lab. Make sure the markers don't fall off. Make sure they stick back on. Does the kid understand the movement? Is there some extraneous thing that's getting caught up in the camera and we're not getting a clear picture of motion? Then the other thing is once you've done that, then to sort through all that data is also probably the most tedious part of it. So a lot of times we might take a kid into a 3D motion capture lab and get all this data on them, and then the data just sits and we never do anything with it. So a really exciting partnership that we are exploring in the future is with a company that does markerless 3D motion capture. Which I was excited too. That's like so well cued. So markerless 3D motion capture, which is going to really change the ability to look at predictive motion, and they've come up with all these algorithms, so on and so forth, that can help capture movement 3D and give all kinds of information output. Joint torques, mobility, stability, asymmetries at every joint. It's unbelievable. Really, the timing. So, so after you have all that kind of information, it also synthesizes it for you. So like, let's look at, it captures all this motion and all of these different variables, and then gives a nice synthesized output on what this kid looks like, which is really, really helpful. From there, we would look at what kind of red flags this kid had. And they could have red flags that look like all sorts of things. So this person has maybe a high level of force output, but not the stability to support it. Or this person, there's all kinds of scenarios for each kid. And based on the scenario or the red flags and that kid's evaluation, they'll get slotted to the appropriate programming that gets pushed out to them to basically correct those types of deficiencies, which is really, really cool, and I'm super excited about that future. The nice thing is you could capture all kinds of data and utilize it in a number of different ways. We'll talk about it a little bit later. So, so when you're looking at motion analysis, you want to select your movements. Choose movements that are relevant to the sport that you are training. So for basketball, we do a jumping, bilateral jumping, like a tuck jump, if you guys know that. And we also do a single leg bounding with a change of direction. And I'll talk a little bit about why we chose those in a moment. But you want to use movements that are relevant to the sport you're training. So if you're training something with baseball, you might choose a more upper body heavy movement to test as well. All right. So after you finish your motion analysis, you want to kind of synthesize the output that you've gotten. So we have all this information, all this data, and now what does it mean? And your information output should translate to recommendations. So that's kind of how we use it. We collect all this data about how this kid moves, and then we synthesize it, create this injury risk profile for a kid, so what type of injury they're at risk for and why, and then that feeds or drives our recommendations. All right, so we've done this. We talked a little bit about the injury risk profile. I already talked about it. And then we want to get to the individualized targeted intervention. So the nice thing about this is there's specificity. So two kids could be at risk for the same injury but for different reasons. So there has to be specificity in your prescription. So some of the main ideas that we look at is we want progressive programming. So this is one of my big beefs when people do injury risk reduction. Is here, take these 3 to 5 exercises, do them for the rest of your career here, and you should be good. And as I mentioned, no other skill development works that way, and certainly injury risk reduction doesn't either. So it has to be progressive. You have to be thinking about building stability in that kid. So just as you would progress any strength program or any skill development, the same type of layering has to be done with injury risk reduction. We use a lot of matrix progressions. So it's not just, a lot of people say, well, what are my progressions? And it doesn't work exactly like that. There are progressions, and then they're in a matrix style. So think about them as a puzzle piece, and you're kind of fitting them and moving them based on what the kid needs. We want to make sure that we are sport and athlete specific. So when we choose our programming or our exercises, we are making it relevant and meaningful to the sport that the kid is in. As I mentioned before, you want to really focus on systematic stability development, layer by layer. And eventually we want to manipulate those default mechanics so that they are no longer in those dangerous positions. And you do that through the systematic training of this better stability in the kid. And some of them will get, if you have like a baby deer, obviously as they get stronger, that will also improve the situation. What you cannot do is tell a kid to jump in front of a mirror 20 times, keep their knees out, and expect that to translate to on-field performance. That's not the way it works. And you are not there as they're coming down from their layup whispering in their ear, keep your knees out. So that's not what they're thinking about. They're just going to go right back to their default mechanics. So you have to figure out a way to change their default mechanics. And that is through the stability training and that lower cerebellum stuff, okay? Because we don't want them consciously thinking, I have to keep my knees out. That's not realistic to competition. So we really want to train from that lower part of the brain, that not conscious part of the brain, so that it is automatic movement to them, all right? And we can talk a little bit about that as we go along. All right. The other ways that we would use the information that we got from testing is they can help inform strength and conditioning decision making. So maybe a kid isn't ready to load up and squat. Maybe they don't have the stability to do that. So with some of this motion output, we see kids that have huge amounts of force output but very low levels of stability, which is a very dangerous situation, right? Because you have a kid who's a freak athlete producing a ton of force but doesn't have the foundation to support that force. That is dangerous. So we can use a lot of this information to say, well, maybe this is a kid we should start with some single leg stuff. Maybe they don't have the stability to support a squat or a hang clean. Maybe we should start them in a Bulgarian squat with dumbbells or something like that to get them a little bit more developed from a stability side before, so that they can go and load up on a squat eventually. Because the thing that stops a person from continuing to get stronger in a squat is rarely the legs, right? What is it? The back, the core, okay? If you put them on a leg press, they could probably do more weight. The reason they can't go up and squat is because of a lack of stability. And then you might want to put a belt on them and all this other stuff. But especially with youth athletes, I don't know if we should be throwing a belt on them before they have the stability to support a weight. And by I don't know, I would say it's my personal opinion we shouldn't. especially, you know, they're not doing an outrageous amount of weight like a bodybuilder that there's no way the body might be able to support this ever, but should you have a belt on a kid squatting 165 pounds? No, if they can't stabilize to support 165 pounds, maybe they should be doing another lift. All right, I just talked about power output versus stability, so this is what I'm talking, a mismatch in that. Being able to identify that in a kid and make a program, maybe 2 sessions on a program, one for those people who are better lifters and more stable, and one for those novice ones that are coming in. And a lot of people at the college level do this with their freshman lifts versus upperclassmen lifts. The other really nice thing that we can get from this, most likely, and it's a big topic in college sports now, it's fatigue monitoring. So we know as the season goes on, fatigue plays a larger role in injury and things along those lines. So we might be able to test the kid and see where they are at from an asymmetry standpoint, from a stability standpoint. And if we see some red flags from that, figure out a way to make recommendations or changes to our programming to address that. The nice thing about this that I didn't mention was that this type of motion capture that I was speaking about earlier, instead of taking a half hour, 45 minutes, an hour for each kid to run through, it takes about 7 to 10 minutes for each kid, which is huge from a time efficiency standpoint. And the last part is data tracking. So for those of you who are really super interested in research and really monitoring your results over time, it provides a lot of good data tracking. All right, so we look at kind of what happens once we get on a program and what happens to the mechanics. So like anything, we want to kind of do some repeated measures. We don't know if we're being successful at something if we aren't doing some retesting. So the retesting serves as a way for us to monitor that and us to know whether or not we need to tweak something. This is a kid of ours from Michigan State, who and she was a senior at the time that this footage was taken. So it's not like she was a novice lifter in college or anything like that. And if any of you know the strength and conditioning coach at Michigan State Red, he's a very good friend of mine. We work collaboratively quite often. He's awesome. So this kid obviously started at a very bad situation here. 35 degrees, okay? So she started the program, and in about 6 weeks we had some retesting done, and you can see that the knees are starting to correct. The other thing is that during testing we don't give any cues, none. We want to just see what their normal movement is. So this is screenshots from a tuck jump, and we are screenshotting the point of the most egregious mechanics. Okay, so people always ask me at initial contact, at takeoff, at lowest center of mass, the most egregious biomechanics is what we usually work with. So then about 16 weeks into it, we can see she's starting to correct pretty nicely with 5 degrees. Again, kid of ours from Colorado, that is rough, really rough. She probably corrected faster than anybody we've ever had. This is not typical. I'll give that disclaimer, but it was amazing that she made that quick of an improvement. The important thing, especially with her, was that she had already had one ACL tear in high school, so her predisposition was a lot higher. So for her, she participated in the SES, probably she did it more than anyone, like 5-6 days a week. And like I said, for her, it's super important, especially with women. For those of you who coach women, they are up to 8 times more likely to tear than men. So a lot of times surgeons will say that the re-tear rate is something between 3 and 5%. And that is true maybe of the general population, but for athletes returning to the same level of sport, once you tear your ACL, once you are at a 30%, 30% of those go on to suffer another ACL tear within the first 2 years, which is huge. 21% of that is the opposite leg, and 9% is the same leg. Within the first year, that athlete is 15 times more likely to tear again, which is an unbelievable statistic and very scary. So we want to really make sure we are doing the most for that kid in those first 2 years, which are critical. Second, first 2 years back, they are 6 times more likely to tear again. Okay, so we've kind of collected a little bit of data, and our company has been, we are going into our 7th season. That's how I count things now in my life, just by seasons. So we are going into our 7th season. We've probably evaluated at this point somewhere between 3,000 some athletes, and had them evaluated, putting them on an SES program, and we have less than 0.5% tear rate, which is pretty crazy. 10 minutes? Oh God. All right. So if you think about the tear rate for basketball, college basketball is 1 in 5 or 20%. Less than 0.5% tear rate is huge. That would be like your coach coaching for 70 years and experiencing maybe 4 or 5 tears. So the tears that we have experienced are due to something, all of the scenarios were an overreach risk. So this is a really dangerous scenario and a little bit different than if somebody is jumping, landing, or neuromuscular control problem. This is when a kid gets their foot so far out in front of them that their foot goes flat, okay? So if you have that flat foot and then she had to all of a sudden change direction to change for defense or something like that, she wouldn't be able to unstick this foot from the floor because her body isn't over her. So she'd have her foot all the way out there, go to turn, and the foot would stay planted in the ground and the ACL would pop. This is a very, very dangerous scenario. There's not a lot you can do about that because of that situation. So you want to make sure that you train them to not ever get in that situation. So you want them to be more in this scenario so that if she had to change direction, she could unstick this heel from the floor. And the way we do that is we have like our own little jump training for this overreach correction. We do a lot of jumping where we create a scenario that the kid has to get their body over them, because for this, it's just a matter of habit, really. So that might be single leg bounds with a cone tap in front, or single leg bounds where you place a cone in front so that the kid has to get over their body and they can't stay back out like this, because there's no way you could put that cone down in front of you with your foot that far out in front. Okay? So there's a lot of different ways you can mess with that, but we also add that as a supplement. We do it normally, we give it, and they add it to some kind of plyo training. All right, so the emphasis we talked about before: individualization, progression, comprehensive sport specificity, accessibility, efficiency. Okay, so we like to create a program that doesn't take an extra 30 minutes to do. We want to make it as efficient as possible. So normally, we make our programs about 10 to 15 minutes, okay? And what they do is they get their frequency in, because we don't necessarily, when you train that lower part of the brain, it's about practice. It's not necessarily, you don't advance in the same way like you would with strength, where you're gonna add sets, add reps, add weight. For this, you are adding practice time, changing stability surfaces. That's the way you progress a program like this. So normally, the strength and conditioning sports performance coach, somebody is in charge of delegating the program. We like to attach it to an already defined work time. So right before a lift or right before practice, so that they can do it, get it, and then go right into their lift or right into practice. We like them to know what they're doing coming in. So for instance, if we're providing a program to a team, they get the program sent out to them. They have access to it through our online video catalog, or the person in charge of it does. And so they already know what the exercises are coming in. They can hit them and go right through it. When do I graduate from SES? This is a question we get all the time. Never. You never graduate from SES. Never, never, never. The same way you wouldn't say to a kid, wow, you look strong enough. No need to come to lift anymore. Or, your ball handling has really improved, go ahead and skip practice. No, you never do that, and it's the same with SES. If you are lifting, if you are playing a sport, you are doing it, you are continually doing it. It is a skill that will regress if you don't practice it like anything else. So, maybe the team would get their program on a Sunday. They have the same exercises for 2 weeks. We normally say we want 6 exposures in 2 weeks, at least. And then every 2 weeks the program gets progressed. We find that in the beginning of those 2 weeks, it's really challenging for them, and then by the end of those 2 weeks, as long as they've got their exposures in, they're masters at it. So they log in, great username, password, and they would have 3 videos pop up like this. So this is like a really advanced exercise that wouldn't be in their first few weeks of programming. I also want to point out that that is me. I know you guys might not have believed that before, but it is. So they might have these 3 exercises for their 2-week period of time. They would do it right before their lift, and then they'd go into their lift. Or they'd do it right before practice and go into their practice. We normally don't utilize that much weight. I know this shows a lot, but we probably wouldn't do anything more than 10 pounds. They're not necessarily fatiguing from like, I'm going to squat 300 pounds standpoint, but they are from a specificity of movement. Okay? All right. I hope this video works. Last time there was just a sound and it's an awkward sound, so we'll see. This is Shanice Johnson, or Momo. She plays with the Indiana Fever right now. So this would have been one of the exercises also. And so unlike strength and conditioning exercises that we typically do, we don't want, like I said, a lot of cueing, because we want a kid to figure out the natural strategy for stabilization. So I'm not sitting there telling her, squeeze your right butt cheek, squeeze your left butt cheek. Her own body has to figure out the stabilization strategy that's appropriate so that she can stay on the ball. Okay? And that's what we want, because we want to change their default pattern, not necessarily give them a ton of input. So unless they're doing something wacky and crazy, we don't give a ton of cueing, because we want it kind of happening from a non-cerebral standpoint. We want it happening from like a natural movement correction standpoint. And their body will eventually weed out, with their synapses firing, weed out the appropriate strategy, because almost all of the exercises are self-limiting. So what I mean by that is that if you are squatting, you can squat incorrectly and still perform the movement, okay? For this, if your body doesn't figure out the appropriate stabilization strategy, you won't stay on the ball. So there's a clear delineation between success and failure. And we try to make all of our exercises like that, so that we don't need to give a ton of cueing. We just want the body to start to naturally learn how to stabilize correctly. Okay. Here's some of my references. Any questions, comments, or concerns? I know that was quick in the end, so Jim got me riled up with that 10-minute warning. Yeah?
So, one of the issues that I have, like the FMS and some of the other tests, becomes laboratory-like in that, the first time you test an athlete, you get a very good indication of what you're doing, but then they learn the test, and so in a clinical setting like that, has there been any, have you looked at doing anything in terms of maybe going to more of creating a jumping situation, a landing situation in practice, that you're able to get that same kind of landing mechanic more in a game-like situation when not thinking about it?
Tweak the testing like that, as if you were going to add in some kind of toss with their landing, if you were going to do a drop vertical jump or something along those lines. Usually when we do the tuck jump, we do kind of the protocol outlined by Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And the nice thing with the tuck jump, why we don't do just one and done, is there's some repetition in motion. And so what we see is that even if they're good in the beginning, if they have a problem with movement, it will degrade as the testing goes along. So it's hard for them that's why we don't put as much emphasis on the FMS in terms, we use it more subjectively than objectively, the FMS. But with the tuck jump, we see that they cannot usually maintain that focus on jump landing for the entire duration of the tuck jumps. The other one with the single leg bounding, which you saw when we talked about the overcorrection, it's pretty hard for them to control that, because it's a change of direction, and we don't see the same kind of training effect that you might see with something like the FMS at a slower, more controlled speed.
So those two are just a part of a battery of tests?
Yeah, we use a battery of tests. So we use those two tests, and we use some other movement-specific tests that are at a little bit slower speed, so that we might be able to help support what we're seeing on video. Good question.
I think Gray Cook came out with something called the functional capacity screen in the last several months. What are your thoughts on that and its relevance to what you're doing?
So I haven't used it, and I think it's probably an expanded version of kind of what the FMS is that
It's supposed to look at the capacity instead of just a stationary movement. So it's starting to go into more, I don't know for sure, I haven't looked it up.
It's the Y balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, the Y balance, we used to use it in our testing and then we got rid of it because it wasn't telling us any new information. And again, it was still kind of at a slow and controlled speed. If I was going to keep any part of the Y balance, I would probably keep the anterior reach more than anything. But again, we want to capture video. It's the gold standard for being able to understand how these kids will look in their sport. So we want to use video analysis to really pinpoint where this is. 3D motion analysis is the biomechanics motion analysis is the gold standard for research, and we want a applicable version of that in sports. And so we rely most heavily on looking at video.
You're at liberty to say which company it is that you're pairing up with for the video analysis, the 3D that you were talking about?
Right, so I'm not going to say it right now because we're still kind of working out the details, but okay. I will say that when it happens, it will be huge.
I'm sorry. Have you kept track of the data in terms of the number of kids you deal with who've had injuries that are single sport athletes as opposed to ones that are multi-sport?
So that's a really good question. Such a good question, and I fear that it will get me on a further tangent. We haven't looked at the data mainly because we don't have time. It probably is in our vault, but we just haven't sorted through it. That's a really good question, and if I had to make a hypothesis based solely on my opinion, we would find that kids that specialize earlier probably are at higher risk. Some of the stuff now with the younger kids in AAU and some of it, not all of it, some of it has gotten really out of control. And so these kids at a young age are playing a ton of volume, really high demand, and don't have the training to support it. So when we first started this company, we worked mainly in the collegiate realm because of a lot of reasons. It was easily implementable, it was a controlled environment, things like that. Then we were seeing that these kids from high school were coming to us so jacked up, like already 2 ACLs by the time you get to college. That's crazy. So we opened up to high schools and lower age sports to try and start this training earlier so that these kids weren't coming where we had to undo all, like coming to us as wrecks. And we found that a lot of kids that we started with in high school are now going to colleges that we're paired up with, and that longevity over time is really helping keeping people healthy and safe. And so we, to answer your question, if I had to guess, probably earlier specialization as it is pushed now, as it's formatted now, is probably contributing. Good question, yeah.
So, I don't know how much you've done with now high schools, but are you seeing interventions working faster with younger kids or slower compared to the collegiate?
Well, it depends on a number of factors, but probably faster.
Okay.
Especially because there's 2 things. One, at high school, they're a little bit cleaner of a slate. Maybe they don't have as many bad habits. They haven't been trained as incorrectly. There's not as much jacked upness, I guess, for lack of a better word. And because of that, we also, in college, we take every kid and each kid has their own program. At the high school level, we usually see more generalization ability, which helps because at the high school level you might have 40 kids and one coach to try and monitor all those kids is crazy. So what we do is we look at them and group them into general groupings of deficiencies and send them down one of 3 tracks so that that coach only needs to know 9 exercises, or what we like to do is give them a leadership role and say, all right, you're in track 1, you're the leader of track 1. No matter what, you need to know what your group is doing when you come to lift, and same thing on the other tracks. But yes, and if you can start them early on this type of stuff, it's going to save them and you a world of trouble going forward.
How do you know the cerebellum is being trained? Are you doing some type of monitoring of that pre and post your programs? Or? Research
is how you know.
Yeah.
So most exercises that include some type of stability situation are utilizing the cerebellum. It's cerebellum-driven correction.
Well, when you go back to a sport like movement, are you able to look at activity levels to know that that is actually changing, or is it you're just looking at?
No, you're thinking, yeah, we're making the correlation between improved movement as a result of that, and then you're looking at decreased injuries. Yeah. So we're extrapolating from the science that we do know, because I don't know how easy it would be to hook up somebody's brain and have them do a sport-specific movement. But we're extrapolating. We know that A and B and C are true, so we're affecting those for this end result.
I wonder if you're noticing any improved performance in the classroom. I know years ago with learning disabilities like dyslexia, they tried balance training, stability training, and high-intensity aerobic exercise as well as therapeutic interventions. I'm just wondering if you're noticing kids participating in the stability training. Is there some kind of transfer in the classroom?
That's a good question. We don't know, and if there is, we'll take responsibility for it, and if there isn't, those are your bad kids. We don't know anything about it.
Right, thank you so much. Selena is going to be around. Let's give her a round of applause. Selena's going to be around.